Her own son called her a simple old woman, laughing behind her back that her ignorance was above mercy, while he desperately begged for a meeting with the mysterious genius Benefactor who held his entire university career in their hands. He never imagined the embarrassing mother he planned to hide at the back of the gala was the very benefactor he was trying to impress. The Sunday dinner table at my son Alistair's house was a polished mahogany battlefield, and I, as usual, was its designated Switzerland. The scent of Beatrice's rosemary chicken, a little dry as always, mingled with the thick aroma of intellectual superiority that permanently perfumed their home. Alistair was holding court, carving the bird with a surgeon's precision. At 52, he still had the lean, hungry look of a PhD candidate, but his hairline was in a tactical retreat, and his eyes carried the permanent strain of a man terrified of becoming irrelevant. He launched into a familiar lament about the appalling quality of his undergraduate students' papers, blaming it on texting and the general decline of Western civilization. His wife Beatrice, who held a doctorate in art history, nodded sagely, adding her own complaint about students wanting to debate modern art before they could even recognize the masters. I just smiled and passed the mashed potatoes. My role in these weekly symposiums was to be a quiet, appreciative audience, to be mother. A simple, sweet, harmless old lady who wouldn't know the canon from a canon. They loved me for it. It made them feel secure, I think. The conversation inevitably turned to the real source of their anxiety, money and status. Alistair complained bitterly about the budget cuts at the university. He said they expected world-class research on a shoestring budget, and he was tired of competing with institutions that had 10 times their endowment. He wondered aloud how he was supposed to innovate when his lab equipment was practically vintage, and the idiots in the grant office were tightening the purse strings. Beatrice patted his hand, her bracelets making a soft metallic sound. She told him his brilliance wasn't dependent on funding, but her eyes held a flicker of deep-seated anxiety. She made a pointed comment about how important it was to keep up appearances, especially in their circle. The brilliance was a given, but the funding was their lifeblood. It paid for this oversized house in the university district, the German sedan in the driveway, and the carefully curated illusion of academic aristocracy. The conversation flowed around me, a river of anxieties and ambitions I wasn't meant to navigate. I was just the gentle shoreline, the place where the turbulent waters could rest. I finished my chicken, folded my napkin, and began clearing the plates as they moved to the living room for coffee. Their voices drifted back to me lower now, more candid. I paused in the hallway, a stack of porcelain in my hands, hidden by the turn of the wall. I heard Alistair let out a heavy sigh, the sound thick with exhaustion. He told Beatrice that sometimes he was just glad I didn't have a degree because it kept things simple. Beatrice's voice was softer, laced with a pity that felt sharper than any insult. She knew, she said, but she reminded him that if they did manage to get to the Founders' Gala, he needed to be mindful. She said she didn't want me getting cornered by the dean and trying to talk to him about my petunias. Then I heard a low chuckle from my son, a sound that hollowed out a space in my chest. He thought the idea was absurd. Can you imagine the embarrassment, he asked her. He thanked God I didn't understand their world. He said I was happy in my little bubble. He called it a mercy. I stood perfectly still, the weight of the plates in my hands, suddenly feeling immense. A bubble. That's what they saw. A small, transparent, fragile sphere of existence. It never occurred to them that what they saw as a bubble might from the inside be a lens. The sting of my son's words that I was happy in my little bubble, that my ignorance was a mercy, stayed with me all week. It wasn't anger I felt, not exactly. It was a profound sense of clarity, like a lens clicking into sharp focus. They didn't see me at all. They saw a reflection of their own needs, a simple, harmless old woman who made them feel intelligent and important. A few days later, my phone rang. It was my granddaughter Chloe, her voice a frantic whisper. She told me I would not believe the fit her dad was throwing. The official guest list for the university founders' gala was out, and his main rival from the physics department had secured a table. Alistair was convinced it was because the man was cozying up to the administrator of something called the Veritas grant. I hummed noncommittally, asking if that grant was an important one. Chloe almost shrieked. It was the only one that mattered, she explained. It was a massive, anonymous grant that funded half the science and engineering departments, and her dad's own grant renewal was up for review with them next quarter. He was acting like it was the end of the world. That Sunday, the atmosphere at dinner was glacial. Alistair's mood was thunderous. He wasn't just complaining. He was radiating a desperate, panicked energy. He called the whole system a political sham where merit meant nothing, and everything came down to who you could corner for a 5-minute chat at a cocktail party. He pushed his plate away, his face pale with stress, and I heard him tell Beatrice that his entire proposal, years of his work, could be dead in the water because he couldn't get into that room to have a word with Dean Evans. His voice, usually so full of arrogant certainty, cracked with genuine fear. The performance of academic outrage was gone, replaced by the raw panic of a man who felt his legacy slipping through his fingers. He threw his napkin down on the table, the drama of the gesture lost in the very real tension that gripped the room. He truly believed his career was on the line, and perhaps it was. I waited until Beatrice was serving the coffee, the clatter of spoons filling the charged silence. Then I reached into my handbag, the same one they imagined was filled with tissues and hard candies, and pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope. It was embossed with the university crest. I placed it on the mahogany table between the sugar bowl and the cream pitcher. It landed with a soft, definitive weight that cut through all the noise. I told Alistair that I hated to see him so worried. I explained that I had a table for the gala, that a dear friend on the board couldn't use it, and had insisted I take it. I thought there were about 6 tickets, I said, and asked if they would do. 3 heads swiveled to look at the envelope. Chloe's eyes were wide with shock. Beatrice froze, the coffee pot hovering in her hand. Alistair just stared, his mouth slightly agape. The arrogant mask had shattered, replaced by pure, uncomprehending confusion. His hand trembled slightly as he reached out and, as if it might be a trick, picked up the envelope. He pulled out the heavy cardstock tickets, each one bearing the university's gold seal and the words, "The Chancellor's Circle, Admit 1, VIP tickets." A full table right near the stage. The silence in the room was a new kind of silence. It wasn't their comfortable silence of ignoring me or the awkward silence of their arguments. It was the ringing silence of a world that had suddenly tilted on its axis. Alistair finally found his voice, asking in a choked whisper where I had gotten them. I just repeated what I'd said before, that a friend had given them to me. They were staring at me, then really staring for the first time in years. They weren't looking at Mother. They were looking at an anomaly, a sweet, simple old woman who had just solved an unsolvable problem with an impossible answer. And for the first time, I could see a flicker of a new emotion in their eyes, just beneath the shock. It was fear. They had absolutely no idea who I was. It took them 2 full days to construct a narrative they could live with. The human mind is a remarkable thing. It can build a fortress of delusion around itself to protect a cherished belief. Their cherished belief was that I was simple, and they were not. The explanation, when it came, was delivered via a stilted phone call from Beatrice. Her voice was artificially bright, the kind you use when you're trying to convince yourself of something. She said it was just so wonderful about the gala and that she and Alistair had been thinking. She asked if my friend on the board was that lovely gentleman I volunteered with at the library fundraiser, the one whose wife had passed last year. I could hear the gears turning the desperate search for a logical, non-threatening box to put me in. A lonely, wealthy widower from their world. Of course, a man of his station would naturally have access, and he would naturally take pity on a sweet, unassuming widow like me. It made sense. It kept me small. It allowed them to believe the tickets were a fluke, an anomaly they could control. I told her he was a very kind man, leaving the answer just vague enough. Her relief was a palpable gust of wind through the phone line. With the source of the tickets now safely categorized, she moved on to the next phase of their strategy, managing me. She said these events could be so overwhelming, and that Alistair thought it was best if I just let him handle any introductions. You know how stuffy these academics can be. She'd said we wouldn't want you to feel uncomfortable. The message was perfectly clear. We will contain you. We will make sure you don't embarrass us. I played my part. I told her that was very thoughtful, and that I would just try my best not to get in the way. I even asked her what she thought I should wear. They thought they had it all figured out. They thought they had reasserted control. While they were busy planning my outfit and coaching me on how to behave, I was engaged in my own preparations. The day before the gala, my workshop didn't smell of potting soil and lavender. It smelled of ozone and hot metal. The knitting needles were put away. In their place on my large workbench were the schematics for a new articulated prosthetic joint. The design used a novel synthetic polymer that responded to myoelectric signals with a fluidity that had stumped a dozen university labs, including my son's. My laptop was open not to a gardening blog, but to a secure video call. On the screen was David, the sharp 40-something director of my foundation. His backdrop, a sleek office in Chicago. He told me the quarterly reports from the university were in. The Veritas grant was performing as expected, he said, but there was a flag on Dr. Finch's lab. His progress had stalled. The review board was suggesting his funding be reallocated at the end of the fiscal year. I looked at the schematics in front of me, at the elegant solution to a problem my own son was failing to solve. I told David that Alistair worked better under pressure and to let the review stand for now. He needed to feel the heat. David then asked if I was ready to stop being a ghost at the gala. I told him the family had a plan to manage me because they were very concerned I might embarrass them. A rare laugh escaped him. He joked he could have the university president meet me at the door with a marching band. I told him no, a quiet entrance would be far more effective. I ended the call and looked around my workshop. This was my sanctuary, the place my late husband Robert had built for me, always encouraging my tinkering. After he passed, that tinkering became my life's work. I had built a world they couldn't see, a world of science and innovation and philanthropy, all under the simple, anonymous name I'd chosen for my first patent, Veritas. Truth. They were getting ready for a party. I was getting ready for a reckoning. They thought they were bringing their quaint, simple mother to a fancy event. They had no idea they were walking into my house. The grand ballroom of the Chancellor's building was a galaxy of glittering chandeliers and suffocating self-importance. Alistair, dressed in a tuxedo that seemed a size too tight around the collar, steered me through the crowd with the grim determination of a man piloting a precious but potentially explosive barge through a regatta. He kept muttering for me to stick close his eyes, darting around the room, cataloging every trustee, dean, and potential rival. Beatrice, shimmering in emerald silk, flanked my other side. She whispered that she saw Dean Evans and urged Alistair to go say hello while she and Chloe kept a seat for me. They herded me toward our designated table, a prime spot near the stage that I knew had cost my foundation a small fortune. My family, however, attributed its excellent placement to the benevolent generosity of my imaginary lonely widower. They seated me firmly in a chair facing the floral centerpiece, my back to most of the room. It was a strategic containment, and I obliged them sipping my water, the perfect picture of placid obedience. Alistair returned minutes later, his face pale. He said the dean had been dismissive, that he'd brushed him off while looking for someone else. He called the whole thing a disaster. The barely concealed panic was back, turning his face to a stony mask. It was then that a hush fell over the tables nearest to us. The constant murmur of the crowd parted like the Red Sea. Making his way toward us, his face beaming, was the university president himself, a portly man named Charles Albright. And at his side, looking serious and purposeful, was Dean Evans. Alistair scrambled to his feet, a hopeful, sycophantic smile plastered on his face. He puffed out his chest and extended a hand, preparing to greet them, ready to seize his 5-minute chat. The president walked right past the outstretched hand as if it were a piece of furniture. His eyes and the dean's were fixed on me. They stopped at my chair. I slowly turned to face them, feeling the weight of my family's shocked gaze. The president's face broke into a smile of genuine, profound warmth. He called my name, asking how I was, and said they were all hoping I'd make it. He was worried I might find it all a bit too stuffy for my tastes. I smiled back, telling him I wouldn't miss it, that the canapés were surprisingly good this year. Dean Evans leaned in his expression, one of deep respect. His voice was low, meant for me, but in the sudden ringing silence around our table, it carried like a trumpet blast. He called me Ms. Veritas. He said the schematics I'd sent over for the new myoelectric polymer were revolutionary, that his team was astounded. He told me that I had single-handedly revitalized the entire engineering department. Ms. Veritas. The name hung in the air, a grenade with the pin pulled. Alistair, Beatrice, and Chloe were frozen, a tableau of disbelief. Their faces, white with shock, turned from the dean to me and back again. My son's mouth opened and closed silently. He looked at me as if I'd just sprouted a second head. The woman he'd warned not to talk about petunias was being lauded by the two most powerful men at the university for her work in engineering. The president, oblivious to the family drama imploding at the table, beamed at me. He said they wouldn't keep me, but they just wanted to say hello before the main event. He told me everyone was on the edge of their seats to finally hear from me directly. He patted my shoulder with a familiarity that made my children flinch as if they'd been tasered. As the two men walked away, the silence they left behind was deafening. The neighboring tables were buzzing with whispers, their occupants staring openly. I saw Alistair's rival, Dr. Albright, watching from 2 tables over his jaw, slack with utter astonishment. My son slowly sank back into his chair. The blood had drained from his face. The foundation of his world, the bedrock belief in his own superiority, and my simplicity, had just been pulverized. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a dawning, terrifying horror. He managed to whisper my name, his voice choked. He asked what that was. He looked completely lost. I calmly unfolded the napkin in my lap. I told him that was the dean of engineering, and I suggested he should try to have a word with him later. I heard I said that the dean was very interested in material stress tolerances. The rest of the meal was a silent, agonizing affair. My family didn't eat. They just stared at their plates, occasionally flicking terrified glances at me as if I might suddenly burst into flames. The confident, condescending academics had vanished, replaced by 3 pale, bewildered ghosts. The air crackled with unspoken questions they were too frightened to ask. When the dessert plates were cleared, President Albright returned to the stage, his face glowing with an excitement that filled the entire ballroom. He tapped the microphone, and a reverent hush fell over the crowd. He began by talking about the future of the university and about the engine of innovation that had been powering it for years. He spoke of a remarkable and remarkably private benefactor. He said the university had only known this individual by a single name they had chosen for their first patent, a name that had become synonymous with progress and genius in their field, Veritas. A wave of respectful murmurs swept the room. I glanced at Alistair. He sat rigid in his chair, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists on the table. The name the one Dean Evans had uttered just an hour before was now echoing through the hall. He was connecting the dots, and the equation was leading to a conclusion so impossible it was contorting his face into a mask of pure dread. The president continued, his voice swelling with drama. He told the audience that this evening, their keynote speaker was the very same inventor who had single-handedly funded their research divisions, the visionary whose work in biomechanics had changed the world, and the philanthropist whose generosity had secured the university's future for a generation to come. He said that for the first time publicly, it was his profound honor to introduce the mind behind the Veritas grant. He paused, letting the anticipation build to a fever pitch, and then he said my name. "Please, welcome, Ms. Gloria Finch." Time stopped. My name, my simple, ordinary name, echoed through the vast, silent hall. Every single head in the room swiveled toward our table. I could feel the weight of hundreds of stares, see the flash of cameras from the press section, hear the collective sharp intake of breath. But my focus was on the three faces I knew best. Chloe's jaw was on the floor, her lawyerly composure utterly gone. Beatrice looked like she had seen a ghost, her hand pressed to her mouth as if to stifle a scream. And Alistair looked broken. The arrogance, the condescension, the entire structure of his identity had imploded, leaving behind nothing but raw, gaping shock. He stared at me. His mother, the woman he'd planned to manage, and his eyes were filled with the horrifying light of absolute, undeniable understanding. I rose from my chair. I smoothed the front of my simple blue dress, the one Beatrice had approved as suitably quiet, and walked toward the stage. The walk felt both infinitely long and incredibly short. Each step was a quiet reclamation of a lifetime of being underestimated. The silence in the room was absolute. The only sound was the soft tap of my sensible shoes on the floor. I passed tables of esteemed academics, trustees, and donors, their faces a blur of astonishment. I reached the stage, shook the president's trembling hand, and stepped up to the podium. I looked out over the sea of faces, finally landing on my family. They were small, huddled together at their table, the center of a storm of attention. I did not speak of them. My revenge was not so small, so direct. It was bigger. I began by telling them that knowledge is not a destination. It is not a degree you hang on a wall or a title you put before your name. It is a journey. It is the fire of curiosity that drives a child to take apart a clock to see how it works. It is the quiet persistence that keeps a gardener trying new grafts to create a more resilient rose. I looked toward Alistair, whose face was now ghost white. I said that knowledge is not confined to laboratories or lecture halls. Sometimes the most profound breakthroughs come not from a place of theory, but from a place of need. From a simple, practical question: how can we make this better? I spent the next 15 minutes talking about my work. I spoke of the beauty of mechanics, the elegance of material science, the pure joy of solving a puzzle that could give someone the ability to walk again. I talked about my late husband who built me my first workshop and encouraged my tinkering. I spoke of curiosity as the purest form of intellect. I spoke of how true innovation respects no credentials, no seniority, no preconceived notions of who is and who is not qualified. Every word was an elegant academic and utterly devastating indictment of their entire belief system. I wasn't just telling my story. I was dismantling the very definition of intelligence they had used as a weapon against me my entire life. I finished my speech with a simple thank you. For a moment, there was complete silence as the room processed what had just happened. Then the ballroom erupted. It was a tidal wave of sound, of applause, of people rising to their feet. Through the thunderous ovation, I looked at my family one last time. They were not clapping. They were just sitting there exposed and mortified in the ruins of the world they had built. The quiet, simple woman they had pitied had just become the most powerful person in their universe. And the justice was not loud or angry. It was cold, precise, and absolute. The drive home was an exercise in suspended animation. The interior of Alistair's pristine sedan, usually a stage for his pronouncements, was a vacuum of sound. Beatrice stared out her window, her own reflection a ghostly mask in the dark glass. Chloe sat in the back, hunched over, looking at her hands as if they were the most fascinating things in the world. Alistair drove his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the road, as if it were the only solid thing left in a world that had turned to liquid. When we arrived at their house, the silence followed us inside. It filled the grand foyer and flowed into the living room, thick and suffocating, heavier than any argument they'd ever had. Alistair finally turned to me, his face a haggard ruin. He asked why. Just that one word, a dry rasp of a question that held a universe of disbelief. He wanted to know why I wouldn't tell them. I looked at my son, at the brilliant academic who had never once thought to ask about my life beyond my garden and my knitting, and I gave him the simple truth. I told him he never asked. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact. They had never been curious about me, only about how I fit into their perception of me. He flinched as if I'd slapped him. The shock in his eyes curdled into the familiar bitter wine of victimhood. He whispered that I had humiliated him. In front of his colleagues, the president, everyone. He said I made him look like a fool. He chose the unrepentant path, unable to see past his own shattered pride to the role he had played in his own downfall. Beatrice, however, looked at me, and for the first time, I saw a glimmer of horrified self-awareness in her eyes. She told Alistair that he was right, that I had made them look like fools. And then she added, her voice trembling, that it was because they were fools. She sank onto the sofa, the fight gone out of her, and she began the long, painful process of understanding. I didn't stay long. There was nothing left to say. My liberation wasn't about winning an argument with them. It was about no longer needing their approval. The next morning, the university town was buzzing. The story was everywhere. The mysterious benefactor Veritas was Gloria Finch, the quiet mother of the notoriously arrogant Dr. Alistair Finch. At the university, Alistair had to walk through a gauntlet of whispers and stunned stares. His authority, the currency he traded in, was gone. How could he critique a student's work when his own mother, whom he'd openly disdained, was the uncredited genius behind his entire department? He had become a punchline. My life, meanwhile, opened up. The following week, I was in my workshop, the scent of ozone and possibility, now a fragrance of freedom. For the first time in years, the main door was wide open to the world. A young woman stood there nervously clutching a tablet. She was the first recipient of the new Veritas Scholarship for Young Innovators. She asked if I was Ms. Finch, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and terror. She started to tell me about her idea for a self-regulating insulin pump, but said the power source was the problem. I smiled a real, uncomplicated smile and told her to call me Gloria. I stepped aside to let her in, telling her to show me what she had. I told her I loved a good power source problem. She stepped into my world, her face alight with pure, unadulterated curiosity. It was a look I hadn't seen in my own family for decades. The new reality was here, and it was quiet, productive, and filled with the bright promise of shared knowledge. The changes were permanent. I was no longer a secret. I was just myself. She learned that a person's worth is not measured by the degrees they hang on a wall, but by the curiosity they hold in their heart and the quiet work of their hands. Her family, blinded by the very credentials they held so dear, failed to see the universe she built in silence. And she discovered that the most profound justice isn't about loud revenge, but about the simple, undeniable truth finally taking its rightful place in the light.